On a Tuesday morning in October 2024, the emergency board meeting at Silver Line Manufacturing convened with federal investigators present, lawyers lining the walls, and the CEO, who was about to discover that 6 years of smirking at warnings had created a paper trail that would destroy his career and send him to federal prison. The room fell completely silent when 28-year-old Kendra Morrison, the company's senior compliance officer, connected her laptop to the projection screen and displayed a document titled Comprehensive Compliance Violation Log, June 2018, October 2024. 127 entries, each one a warning Kendra had raised about labor law violations, safety regulation breaches, or ethical concerns. Each one dismissed by CEO Harrison Mitchell with the same pattern of arrogant dismissiveness. Each one followed by the exact violation Kendra had predicted, now documented with timestamps, supporting evidence, and federal statute citations. The Department of Labor investigators sitting at the table already had copies. So did the board's attorneys. So did the federal prosecutor, who would be filing criminal charges within the week. Harrison Mitchell's signature smirk, the one he'd worn for 6 years every time Kendra raised a concern, had vanished completely. Because what was on that screen wasn't just evidence of corporate negligence. It was proof of willful violation of federal labor law. Proof that he'd been repeatedly warned by someone who knew exactly what she was talking about and had chosen to ignore those warnings because he couldn't imagine that a black woman who'd started as an intern could possibly know more about compliance than he did. This is a story about what happens when arrogance meets meticulous documentation. When someone in power assumes that dismissing warnings makes problems disappear instead of just making consequences inevitable. When a CEO confuses getting away with something temporarily for getting away with it permanently. And it begins with a question asked in an intern orientation meeting that should have been taken seriously, but instead became the first entry in a compliance log that would eventually become Exhibit A in a federal prosecution. Because what Harrison Mitchell said in response to Kendra's question would set in motion 6 years of violations, warnings, dismissals, and systematic documentation that would cost his company $47 million in fines, cost him his freedom, and prove that the most dangerous person in any organization isn't the one who asks uncomfortable questions once. It's the one who asks uncomfortable questions, gets dismissed, and then spends 6 years documenting every single time reality proves them right. Kendra Yvonne Morrison was born in Silver Spring, Maryland, to parents who'd immigrated from Jamaica with nothing but work ethic and determination. Her father, Winston, worked as a janitor at a government building. Her mother, Grace, cleaned offices at night and worked as a home health aide during the day. Together, they worked a combined 130 hours per week to keep Kendra and her younger sister Shanice in a small apartment in a decent school district. Money was perpetually tight. Kendra wore her clothes until they literally couldn't be repaired anymore. She ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day of middle school because they were cheap and filled her up. She learned early that poverty wasn't just about what you didn't have. It was about the mental exhaustion of calculating every expense, the stress of knowing that one unexpected cost could cascade into crisis, the constant awareness that there was no safety net beneath you. But Kendra had something that poverty couldn't touch. She had a mind that saw patterns and a personality that couldn't tolerate injustice. In high school, she noticed that the wealthier students had access to SAT prep courses that cost hundreds of dollars. She organized a free study group, Using library books and online resources, bringing 20 students from working-class families together every Saturday, 17 of them improved their scores by over 200 points. Kendra's own score was perfect, 1600. She got into Harvard on a full financial aid package, studied government and economics, graduated summa cum laude in 2008. But what really shaped her wasn't the coursework. It was the work-study job she held all 4 years in Harvard's Office of Research Compliance. She learned how regulations worked, how institutions navigated legal requirements, how some organizations built cultures of genuine compliance, while others built cultures of plausible deniability. She also learned something that would prove crucial 6 years later. She learned that compliance violations almost never happen because people don't know the rules. They happen because people know the rules, calculate that the benefits of breaking them outweigh the risks of getting caught, and then create paper trails of willful ignorance to protect themselves if accountability comes. Kendra graduated in May 2008 with job offers from law firms and consulting companies. But she accepted the summer internship at Silverline Manufacturing for 2 specific reasons. First, they offered a pathway to their full-time compliance program, and Kendra wanted to build expertise in corporate compliance before attending law school. Second, the position paid well enough that she could send money home to help her parents, who were both dealing with health issues that made their grueling work schedules increasingly difficult. Silverline Manufacturing was a success story in American business, founded by Harrison Mitchell's grandfather in 1947. The company produced industrial components for construction and manufacturing. By 2018, under Harrison's leadership, Silverline had grown to 1,200 employees across 4 facilities, with annual revenue of $380 million. They were profitable, expanding, and well-regarded in their industry. Harrison Mitchell had inherited the company at age 39 when his father retired. He'd grown up in Greenwich, Connecticut, attended Choate Rosemary Hall and Yale, and learned business from his father, the same way he'd learned everything else, with the assumption that rules were for people who weren't smart enough to know when to ignore them. His philosophy was simple. Regulations existed to protect companies from liability, not to actually be followed when following them was inconvenient or expensive. The key was maintaining plausible deniability while maximizing profit. Under Harrison's leadership, Silverline had cut costs aggressively, reduced safety training from 2 weeks to 3 days, classified some full-time positions as contractor roles to avoid benefits requirements, extended shift lengths without corresponding overtime adjustments, deferred facility maintenance that wasn't immediately critical. Each decision saved money. Each decision also violated specific labor and safety regulations. And each decision was made with careful legal language that created distance between Harrison and the actual implementation. When 22-year-old Kendra Morrison walked into Silverline's headquarters in Hartford, Connecticut for her first day of internship orientation in June 2018, she was one of 8 summer interns. The orientation included the standard elements: company history, workplace policies, safety procedures, benefits information. But it also included something that caught Kendra's attention immediately. The HR director explained that interns would be working 45-hour weeks, Monday through Friday, 9 hours per day. Kendra's hand went up. "Excuse me, the Fair Labor Standards Act requires overtime payment for hours worked beyond 40 in a work week. How is the overtime calculated for the additional 5 hours?" The HR director looked uncomfortable. Intern positions are classified as learning experiences. The compensation is structured as a weekly stipend rather than hourly wages. Kendra pulled out the intern offer letter she'd received. The offer letter specifies compensation of $22 per hour for approximately 45 hours per week. That's an hourly rate, which means FLSA overtime provisions apply. Hours beyond 40 should be compensated at time and a half, which would be $33 per hour for those additional 5 hours. The room went quiet. The other interns looked at Kendra with expressions ranging from admiration to concern about whether she'd just made everyone's first day awkward. The HR director said she'd need to check with leadership about the classification. That afternoon, Kendra was called to a meeting with Harrison Mitchell. She'd never met the CEO before. Didn't expect to during a summer internship, but apparently her question had made it to his attention. Harrison's office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd inherited wealth and power. Original artwork, expensive furniture, windows overlooking the Hartford skyline. Harrison himself was 51, fit from daily tennis at his country club, wearing a suit that cost more than Kendra's entire wardrobe. "Ms. Morrison, please sit." His smile was polite but cold. "I understand you had some questions about our intern compensation structure." "Yes, sir. I wanted to clarify how overtime is being calculated since the position description specifies 45 hours per week at an hourly rate. Let me explain something about how business works in the real world, since they apparently didn't cover this at Harvard." His tone was condescending in a way that made Kendra's jaw tighten. Internship programs are educational opportunities. We bring in students, give them experience, pay them generously for their time. In exchange, we expect flexibility and understanding that business operations don't always fit neatly into regulatory frameworks designed for traditional employment. With respect, sir, the Fair Labor Standards Act doesn't have an exemption for educational value. If the position is compensated hourly and exceeds 40 hours, overtime applies regardless of how we characterize the learning opportunity. Harrison's smile got thinner. "Ms. Morrison, I appreciate your attention to detail, but I've been running this company for 12 years. Our employment practices have been reviewed by attorneys far more experienced than a summer intern with a bachelor's degree in government. I can assure you we are in full compliance with all applicable regulations." "Sir, I'm not questioning your attorneys. I'm pointing out that the offer letter structure creates FLSA overtime obligations that..." "Kendra." He leaned forward and his smile was gone entirely. "Let me be very clear. You have two choices. You can accept the position as offered, which provides excellent compensation for a summer internship and valuable experience for your future career. Or you can continue to create issues about legal technicalities, in which case I'll assume you're not actually interested in the opportunity and we can part ways now." Toes. The threat was explicit. Kendra had student loans. She had parents who needed financial help. She had rent to pay and a future to build. Walking away from this internship meant going back to job searching in June when most positions were filled. But Kendra also had something else. She had a recording device that she'd started running the moment Harrison's assistant called to summon her to this meeting. And she had the absolute certainty that Harrison Mitchell was wrong about the law and knew he was wrong, which made his violations willful rather than negligent. "I'll accept the position, sir. Thank you for clarifying." "Excellent. I'm sure you'll find the summer very educational." His smirk was back, the expression of someone who'd won and knew it. That evening, Kendra created a new folder in her secure cloud storage. She labeled it Silverline Compliance Documentation. The first entry was the intern offer letter, the FLSA statute citation, and a detailed memo documenting Harrison's meeting, including the recording and transcript. She noted the date, the specific violation, and Harrison's explicit acknowledgement that he knew the legal framework but was choosing to structure the program differently. Entry number 1, in what would eventually become 127 documented violations over 6 years. Kendra worked that summer with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything. She documented all 45 hours per week without receiving the overtime pay legally required. She also documented something else. The manufacturing floor had safety procedures that were routinely bypassed when production schedules got tight. Machine guards removed to speed up processes. Break requirements shortened to maintain output. Safety training skipped for temporary workers because training time was unproductive. She raised concerns with her supervisor, Marcus Chen, who managed the compliance department. Marcus was sympathetic but cynical. Look, Kendra, I understand your concerns. I've raised similar issues for 3 years. Harrison's response is always the same. We have insurance, we have legal counsel, and we're running a business, not a university ethics seminar. Document what you see, submit it in your reports, but don't expect anyone to act on it. Kendra documented everything: safety violations, overtime calculation errors, worker misclassification issues. Each concern went into her reports and into her personal compliance log. At the end of summer, she had 15 documented violations with supporting evidence. She was also offered a full-time position, junior compliance analyst, $58,000 per year. She accepted because she needed the income and because she decided something during that summer. If Silverline was systematically violating labor and safety regulations, someone needed to document it thoroughly enough that eventually accountability would be unavoidable. Also, she'd been accepted to Yale Law School's part-time evening program starting that fall. She could work at Silverline during the day, attend classes at night, and use her real-world compliance experience as the foundation for her legal education. And if Harrison Mitchell thought he could continue violating federal law with impunity just because he'd gotten away with it so far, Kendra Morrison was going to be the person who proved him catastrophically wrong. Over the next 6 years, Kendra became Silverline's most thorough compliance officer, while simultaneously becoming Harrison Mitchell's most ignored advisor. She identified violations across every aspect of the company's operations, and each violation followed a depressingly predictable pattern: Kendra's warning, Harrison's dismissal, the inevitable consequence that proved her right. Entry number 18, November 2019. Kendra identified that production supervisors were requiring employees to work through their legally mandated meal breaks during high-volume periods. Federal and Connecticut law required a 30-minute uninterrupted meal break for shifts exceeding 7.5 hours. Employees were being told to eat while monitoring equipment, which legally didn't qualify as a break. Kendra calculated that approximately 80 employees were being systematically denied proper meal breaks, creating wage and hour violations. She submitted a detailed memo citing 29 U.S.C. Section 27 and Connecticut General Statute 3151I, recommending immediate policy changes and back pay calculations for affected employees. Harrison's response email was dismissive. Production supervisors know our workforce. If employees are comfortable eating while monitoring equipment, that's their choice. We're not going to reduce productivity based on overly literal interpretations of break requirements. 6 months later, 3 employees filed complaints with the Connecticut Department of Labor. The investigation found systematic meal break violations affecting 112 employees over 18 months. Silverline was fined $87,000 and required to implement new break monitoring systems. Kendra added it to her log: warning issued, warning dismissed, exact predicted violation confirmed, financial consequence $87,000. Entry number 29, August 2020. Kendra discovered that Silverline was classifying certain full-time machine operators as independent contractors to avoid providing health insurance and other benefits. The workers in question worked 40 to 50 hours per week, used company equipment exclusively, followed company set schedules, and performed work that was core to Silverline's business operations. Under IRS guidelines and Department of Labor standards, these were clearly employees being misclassified to avoid benefit costs. Her report documented 37 misclassified workers and estimated that Silverline was saving approximately $420,000 annually by denying these workers proper classification. She cited IRS Revenue Ruling 8741 and DAL guidelines on employee versus contractor distinctions, recommending immediate reclassification and remediation of back benefits. Harrison's response was blunt. These workers prefer contractor status because it gives them flexibility. They are sophisticated adults who chose this arrangement. Our legal team structured these agreements specifically to comply with applicable guidelines. You're creating problems where none exist. The IRS audit in 2022 determined that all 37 workers were misclassified employees. Silverline owed back taxes, penalties, and interest totaling $1.6 million. The workers filed a class action lawsuit for denied benefits, which settled for $890,000. Total cost of ignoring Kendra's warning, $2.49 million. Entry number 41, March 2021. Kendra identified that Line 12's ventilation system hadn't been serviced in 23 months, despite OSHA requirements for quarterly maintenance and testing. The line processed materials that produced chemical fumes requiring specific air quality standards. Skipping maintenance saved approximately $15,000 annually, but created serious health risks for the 18 workers on that line. Her memo cited OSHA standard 1910, 94 on ventilation requirements and recommended immediate system servicing, air quality testing, and health monitoring for affected workers. Harrison responded with irritation. The system is functioning. Workers haven't reported any issues. OSHA maintenance schedules are recommendations based on worst-case scenarios. We'll service it during our annual shutdown when it's operationally convenient. When OSHA conducted a surprise inspection 9 months later, they found the ventilation system operating at 62% of required capacity. 3 workers on Line 12 had developed respiratory issues. OSHA fined Silverline $230,000 for willful violation of ventilation standards. The 3 affected workers filed workers' compensation claims and personal injury lawsuits. Total cost, over $1.1 million, plus the health damage to 3 human beings who'd been breathing inadequate air for almost 2 years while their CEO dismissed warnings about it. These weren't abstract violations. These were real people being denied legally required meal breaks. Real workers misclassified to save money on benefits. Real human beings breathing contaminated air because maintenance was operationally inconvenient. And every single instance could have been prevented if Harrison Mitchell had spent 1 hour taking Kendra's warnings seriously instead of dismissing them. But Harrison had a pattern of thinking. He believed that regulations were suggestions for companies that couldn't afford legal counsel. That Silverline's profitability proved their practices were sound regardless of what compliance manuals said. That Kendra's warnings represented theoretical concerns from someone who'd never run a business and didn't understand that perfect compliance was impossible in real-world operations. What he never considered was that Kendra wasn't demanding perfect compliance. She was identifying systematic violations that created preventable harm and predictable legal exposure. She wasn't being overly cautious. She was being exactly as cautious as federal law required. And every time he dismissed her as unrealistic, he was actually dismissing federal regulations as unrealistic, which is a very expensive confusion to maintain. But here's what Harrison didn't know. Every dismissal went into Kendra's compliance log. Every violation she predicted materialized exactly as she'd warned. Every time reality proved her right and Harrison wrong, she documented it with timestamps, outcome data, and supporting evidence. By 2020, her log had 43 entries. By 2022, 71. By 2024, 127. Each entry followed the same format. Date of warning, violation identified, regulatory citation, Kendra's recommendation, Harrison's response, actual outcome, financial impact. She also did something else strategic. She'd graduated from Yale Law School in 2022 and passed the bar exam. She was now a licensed attorney with expertise in labor and employment law. She'd also maintained a relationship with her Yale professor, David Chang, who'd left academia to work as an investigator for the Department of Labor. She never violated confidentiality, but she'd positioned herself so that when the moment came, she'd know exactly how to proceed. The moment came in August 2024. When a Silverline employee named Robert Torres suffered a severe injury on the manufacturing floor. Robert was 41 years old, father of 3 children, husband to Maria, who worked as an elementary school teacher. He'd been with Silverline for 9 years, was known as one of the most careful and skilled operators on Line 15. He followed safety protocols religiously, wore all required protective equipment, and had never had a workplace injury in his entire career. On August 14th at 2:17 p.m., Robert was operating a metal stamping press. The machine's safety guard, which was supposed to prevent operators from reaching into the press area while it was cycling, had been removed 3 days earlier by floor supervisors trying to increase production speed during a rush order. With the guard in place, operators had to wait for the full cycle to complete before loading new material. With the guard removed, they could reach in slightly earlier, saving about 4 seconds per cycle. Over a full shift, this saved approximately 23 minutes of production time. Robert had objected to the guard removal, had told his supervisor it was dangerous, had been informed that the guard was a recommendation, not a requirement, and that experienced operators like him could work safely without it. Robert needed his job, needed the income, needed the health insurance that covered his son's asthma medications. So he worked the line with the guard removed. At 2:17 p.m., a piece of metal shifted slightly as Robert was loading it. His hand position adjusted by 2 inches to compensate. The press cycled while his fingers were in the strike zone. The machine's 60 tons of force came down on his left hand. Robert lost his index, middle, and ring fingers, completely severed at the second knuckle. The emergency responders found the fingers in the press mechanism. The surgeons tried to reattach them, but the damage was too severe. Robert Torres would never have full use of his left hand again, would never play guitar with his daughter like he used to, would never grip a baseball to teach his son to pitch, would wake up for the rest of his life remembering that his employer had removed a safety device to save 23 minutes per shift. The machine guard that should have been in place cost $800. The guard's removal violated OSHA Standard 1910. 2012, which explicitly requires machine guarding for point-of-operation hazards on mechanical power presses. Kendra had flagged this exact issue 14 months earlier in June 2023. Her report had been titled, "Critical Safety Violation, Machine Guard Removal Creates Severe Injury Risk." In that report, she documented that guards on lines 7, 12, and 15 were being systematically removed during production rushes. She'd cited the specific OSHA standard. She'd calculated the probability of serious injury at 38% within 18 months, based on incident data from similar operations. She'd recommended immediate reinstallation, disciplinary action for supervisors, authorizing removal, and retraining on machine guarding requirements. Harrison's email response from June 14, 2023 was in Kendra's log. "Kendra, I appreciate your diligence, but I think you're over-interpreting the regulation. The guards in question are protective recommendations rather than absolute requirements for our specific press models. Our floor supervisors have decades of combined experience and wouldn't authorize practices that create actual danger. Our insurance and legal team are comfortable with current procedures. Please focus your compliance efforts on areas where we have actual regulatory exposure." Kendra had replied with a detailed technical explanation of why machine guards were mandatory, not recommended, under the cited OSHA standard. She'd attached the specific regulatory text. She'd included case studies of similar injuries at other facilities. Harrison never responded. The guards stayed removed. Production continued at the faster pace. And 14 months later, Robert Torres paid the price for Harrison's dismissal of warnings with 3 fingers and permanent disability. The OSHA investigation was automatic for severe injuries. When investigators arrived, they found not just the guard removed on line 15, but systematic guard removal across multiple production lines. They found documentation that supervisors had been instructed to prioritize production speed over safety protocols. They found Kendra's June 2023 report and Harrison's dismissive response. They determined the violation was willful, not an accident or oversight, but the deliberate decision to ignore known safety requirements. Harrison Mitchell's attorneys tried to control the investigation. They provided carefully selected documents that showed Silverline had policies and procedures in place. They emphasized the company's long safety record. They characterized Robert's injury as a tragic, isolated incident caused by individual worker error rather than systemic issues. What they didn't know was that someone inside the company had already provided the Department of Labor with comprehensive documentation of systematic violations dating back 6 years. Someone who'd kept meticulous records of every warning raised and ignored. Someone who could prove that violations weren't accidents or isolated incidents, but the result of deliberate cost-cutting decisions made despite repeated warnings from compliance staff. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting in October 2024. Present were the 9 board members, Harrison Mitchell, the company's general counsel, outside attorneys, and 3 Department of Labor investigators. The DOL had completed their investigation. The findings were damning. Systematic overtime violations affecting hundreds of employees, multiple OSHA safety regulation breaches, worker misclassification issues, environmental compliance failures. The estimated fines were $47 million. But more serious than the fines were the criminal referrals. The DOL investigators had determined that violations were willful rather than negligent. That senior leadership had been repeatedly warned about legal requirements and had chosen to ignore those warnings. Willful violation of federal labor law carried criminal penalties, including imprisonment. Harrison sat at the head of the table, looking confident. His strategy was simple: express concern about the findings, commit to remediation, emphasize that any issues were the result of miscommunication or oversight rather than intentional violations, and settle with fines while avoiding criminal exposure. The lead DOL investigator, Sarah Martinez, had other plans. Before we discuss findings and remediation, I want to introduce evidence that's central to our determination of willfulness. Ms. Morrison, would you present your compliance log? Every eye in the room turned to Kendra. Harrison's expression flickered. Confusion mixed with irritation. Why was his junior compliance officer being asked to present to the board? Kendra connected her laptop to the projection screen. The first slide appeared: Comprehensive Compliance Violation Log, June 2018, October 2024. Compiled by Kendra Morrison. J.D. Harrison's face went very still. The board members leaned forward. Kendra's voice was steady and professional. Over the past 6 years, I have documented 127 instances where I identified potential compliance violations, submitted formal warnings with regulatory citations and recommendations, and those warnings were dismissed by CEO Harrison Mitchell. I'm going to walk you through the pattern, starting with entry number 1 from my second day as an intern. She displayed the first entry, the intern overtime issue. Her question in orientation, Harrison's meeting with her, the recording of his explicit statement that he knew the legal framework but was structuring the program differently. The calculation showing that 8 interns working 5 hours of uncompensated overtime per week for 12 weeks represented violation of FLSA, affecting 720 hours of labor. Entry 2, safety guard removal on line 7. Kendra's report dated September 2018, noting that machine guards were being removed during production to increase speed. Harrison's response email. Guards are an OSHA recommendation for certain applications, but not mandatory for our specific equipment configuration. No action needed. Kendra then showed the OSHA citation from 2019, when an inspector found the same guards. Removed and fined, silver line, $18,000. Entry 3, contractor misclassification. Entry 4, overtime miscalculation for salaried employees. Entry 5, environmental disposal shortcuts. On and on. Each entry showing the same pattern. Kendra identifies violation, cites specific regulation, recommends remediation. Recommends remediation. Harrison dismisses concern with justification that sounds plausible but is legally wrong. Violation materializes with financial or legal consequences. The board members' expressions evolved from attentive to shocked to horrified as the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't about oversight or good faith interpretation of complex regulations. This was about systematic dismissal of clear legal warnings from someone who demonstrably understood compliance requirements better than the CEO, listening to her. What destroyed Harrison completely was entry 79, the machine guard issue that had injured Robert Torres. Kendra displayed her report from June 2023. Machine guards on lines 7, 12, and 15 are being systematically removed during production shifts to increase throughput. This violates 29 CFR 1910. 212 regarding machine guarding requirements. Recommend immediate reinstallation and disciplinary action for supervisors authorizing removal. Failure to address this creates severe injury risk and regulatory exposure. Harrison's email response, dated June 14, 2020. Kendra, I appreciate your diligence, but I think you're overinterpreting the regulation. The guards in question are protective recommendations rather than absolute requirements. Our floor supervisors have decades of experience and wouldn't authorize practices that create actual danger. Our insurance and legal team are comfortable with current procedures. Please focus your compliance efforts on areas where we have actual regulatory exposure. Next to Harrison's email, Kendra displayed the OSHA investigation report from Robert Torres's injury. The report explicitly stated that machine guards were mandatory under the cited regulation, not recommendations. That their removal was a willful violation of established safety requirements. That the injury was a direct and foreseeable result of the unauthorized guard removal. The room was completely silent. Sarah Martinez from the DOL spoke into that silence. Entry 79 is the clearest example of what we found systematically across all 127 documented instances. Ms. Morrison identified specific violations, cited exact regulatory requirements, warned of probable consequences, and provided remediation recommendations. Mr. Entry 7, Mitchell dismissed those warnings using language that suggests he either didn't understand the regulations or didn't care about complying with them. She paused, then continued. What Ms. Morrison's log demonstrates conclusively is that violations at Silverline weren't the result of complexity or good faith misunderstanding of ambiguous regulations. They were the result of deliberate decisions to disregard clear legal requirements after being explicitly warned by trained compliance staff. She looked directly at Harrison. That's the definition of willful violation. And willful violation of federal labor and safety law carries criminal liability for corporate officers who made the decisions. Harrison had gone from confident to pale. I was relying on advice from legal counsel. Every decision I made was vetted by attorneys who... Mr. Mitchell, Sarah's voice was sharp. We've reviewed your legal counsel's advice. In 43 of the instances documented in Ms. Nounsel, Morrison's log, your attorneys explicitly agreed with her assessment and recommended remediation. You overruled them. In 61 instances, you didn't consult them at all. In only 23 instances did your attorneys provide advice that differed from Mrs. Proft, Morrison's recommendations, and in 17 of those cases, subsequent regulatory action proved Ms. Morrison correct and your attorneys wrong. She pulled up another document. We've also reviewed your email communications with your general counsel. In March 2021, after Ms. Jordy 21, Morrison submitted her 37th compliance warning. You sent this email. Harrison's own words appeared on screen. How do we get Kendra to stop flooding us with compliance warnings about theoretical violations? She's technically competent, but overly cautious to the point of being disruptive. Every decision comes with some regulatory gray area. I need her focused on real compliance issues, not academic interpretations of every statute. The General Counsel's response, Harrison. I've reviewed her recent submissions. They're not theoretical. They're identifying actual violations that create real legal exposure. I strongly recommend we address her concerns systematically rather than dismissing them. Harrison's reply, noted. But I'm running a business, not a law school. We'll continue current practices. unless actual regulatory action forces changes. Sarah Martinez looked at the board. This email alone demonstrates willful intent to violate regulations despite being informed of legal requirements. Combined with the comprehensive pattern, Ms. D. Morrison has documented, we have overwhelming evidence of systematic willful violations across multiple areas of federal labor and safety law. Board Chairman Robert Davies found his voice. How extensive is the criminal exposure? Mr. Rister. Mitchell faces potential charges for willful violation of federal safety regulations resulting in serious injury, systematic wage theft affecting approximately 340 employees over 6 years, and obstruction of regulatory compliance. We're coordinating with the USS Attorney's Office. Criminal charges will likely be filed within 2 weeks. Harrison tried to respond, but his attorney put a hand on his arm. The board went into executive session. 90 minutes later, they had voted unanimously to terminate Harrison Mitchell as CEO effective immediately. They'd also voted to cooperate fully with federal investigations, implement comprehensive compliance reforms, and offer Kendra Morrison the position of General Counsel, with authority to rebuild the entire compliance infrastructure. The Department of Labor fined Silverline $47 million. The company settled for $33 million by agreeing to extensive reforms and back pay remediation for affected employees. Harrison Mitchell was indicted on 14 federal charges, including willful violation of worker safety laws, systematic wage theft, and obstruction of regulatory compliance. His trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution's key evidence was Kendra Morrison's compliance log. 127 documented instances where a trained compliance officer had warned him about violations, and he'd chosen to ignore those warnings. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on 12 of 14 counts. Harrison was sentenced to 43 months in federal prison and ordered to pay $6.8 million in restitution. But Kendra's documentation did more than send one CEO to prison. It triggered a reckoning across the manufacturing industry about how compliance warnings were treated. The Department of Labor used her log as a case study for a new enforcement framework. Companies that employed compliance officers but systematically ignored their warnings would face enhanced penalties and criminal referrals. 3 other manufacturing companies in Connecticut launched internal reviews of their compliance practices after Silverline's case went public. 2 of them discovered similar patterns. Compliance officers raising concerns that were dismissed by executives focused on short-term cost savings. Both companies implemented reforms before federal investigations materialized. Kendra's compliance log was also incorporated into law school curricula as an example of effective internal documentation for whistleblower cases. She was invited to speak at corporate compliance conferences. Other young compliance professionals reached out asking how to document concerns when leadership wasn't listening. She told them the same thing every time: be meticulous, be persistent, and understand that documentation isn't about changing minds immediately. It's about creating an undeniable record for when accountability eventually arrives. 5 years after that silent boardroom moment, Kendra Morrison stands as General Counsel of Silverline Manufacturing, which is now a model for compliance-focused corporate culture. She's also an adjunct professor at Yale Law School, teaching a course on corporate compliance and whistleblower protections. She tells her students about entry number 1 in her log, the intern orientation question that started everything. The moment Harrison Mitchell smirked at my concern about overtime pay, she tells them, he made a calculation. He decided that a 22-year-old black woman who'd been at his Company, for one day, couldn't possibly understand compliance better than he did after running the business for 12 years. He looked at my age, my race, my position, and he decided my expertise was irrelevant. That smirk was expensive. It cost him his company, his reputation, his freedom, and $47 million in fines, because he never stopped to consider that maybe I actually knew what I was talking about. That maybe my warnings were accurate and his dismissals were the problem. That maybe the person raising uncomfortable questions deserved serious response rather than condescension. But here's what's important for you to understand. I didn't defeat Harrison Mitchell by arguing harder or getting angry or demanding he take me seriously. I defeated him by being right 127 times and documenting every single instance where he was wrong. I let reality make my case while I systematically collected evidence. She pauses, making eye contact with her students. That's the power of compliance documentation. Not to change the minds of people determined not to listen, but to create an undeniable record that makes accountability inevitable when it finally arrives. Kendra Morrison didn't become a CEO, didn't build a billion-dollar empire, didn't achieve the kind of success that business magazines celebrate. She became something more important. She became proof that meticulous documentation defeats arrogant dismissal when the documentation is thorough enough and the patience is strong enough. She also became a voice for compliance professionals who know they're right, but work for leaders who won't listen, who raise concerns that get dismissed, who document violations that no one wants to acknowledge. She tells them, keep documenting, keep being right, keep collecting evidence, because willful ignorance works until it doesn't, and when accountability arrives, your documentation becomes the difference between consequences that can be minimized and consequences that destroy careers. Because here's what Harrison Mitchell learned in federal prison, and what every executive needs to understand before they smirk at their compliance officers' warnings. Compliance professionals don't raise concerns because they're timid or overly cautious or don't understand business. They raise concerns because they're experts in regulatory requirements and they're trying to protect you from catastrophic legal exposure. When you dismiss those concerns without serious technical response, when you substitute judgments about business reality for evaluation of legal requirements, when you smirk at warnings because you can't imagine that the person raising them might know more than you do, you're not being a bold business leader, you're being criminally stupid. Harrison Mitchell dismissed Kendra Morrison 127 times. Every dismissal was a choice to prioritize his assumptions over documented legal analysis. Every ignored warning was a bet that he could continue violating federal law without consequences. He lost every single bet, and the 127th loss cost him everything. $47 million in fines, 43 months in federal prison, a career destroyed, a reputation annihilated, a company that will forever be known as the place where the CEO went to prison because he was too arrogant to listen to the black woman from compliance who kept trying to stop him from committing federal crimes. So ask yourself, who in your organization is raising warnings that you're dismissing? Whose expertise are you ignoring because they don't match your image of what authority looks like? Whose analysis are you smirking at because you can't imagine someone in their position could be right while someone in your position could be wrong? They might be documenting everything, keeping logs of every warning dismissed, every violation predicted, every consequence you could have prevented if you'd listened. And one day, they might walk into a boardroom with federal investigators present and display documentation so comprehensive that your freedom depends on whether a jury believes your ignorance was genuine or willful. Choose differently. Choose to take compliance warnings seriously, regardless of who raises them. Choose to require technical rebuttals rather than dismissals based on hierarchy or assumptions. Choose to recognize that the junior compliance officer who just graduated from law school might understand federal regulations better than the CEO who's been running the company for decades. Choose to listen to Kendra Morrison the first time, instead of the 127th time when listening has become legally mandatory and criminally consequential. Because the most expensive business decision you'll ever make is dismissing someone whose job is to keep you out of prison simply because you've decided they're not worth listening to. This story is a fictionalized account inspired by real cases of willful labor law violations and the critical role of compliance documentation in corporate accountability. In a business world that often treats compliance as obstacle rather than protection, choose to be the leader who recognizes that the person warning you about regulations is trying to save you from yourself. Choose to build cultures where raising compliance concerns is rewarded rather than dismissed. Choose to understand that cutting corners on worker safety, wage requirements, and regulatory compliance isn't bold business strategy. It's criminal liability waiting to happen. Choose to see the warning before it becomes Exhibit A in your prosecution. Choose to respect the compliance officer before their documentation sends you to federal prison. Choose to understand that in the end, arrogance is always more expensive than diligence. And smirking at someone who's trying to keep you out of legal trouble is the most expensive expression you'll ever make.